because I'm about ready to start leveling out this area of my lawn. It's a tiny little area, but roughly parallel to the border between my neighbor's yard and mine. There's a little trough in the grass. Last year, we installed a drain line in there. It was perfectly flat after everything was done, but as expected, that area has settled, and now I have to go over it in weird patterns with my lawnmower to make sure everything cuts at the same height. I'm going to be leveling this with a mixture of sand and soil. But when you just say sand leveling on a lawn, lots of questions come up. Which sand do you use? Well, let me go show you. I've got 5 different kinds of sands over by my garage. I want to show you the difference between them all and explain which one we're not going to use and why, and which one I am going to use and why. Now, there are other kinds of sands that you could purchase, but one of the most common ones that people think of is play sand. This I'm not going to be using. This is paver sand. This is also different, and this is also not what I'm going to be using. Now, over at my local Home Depot, I picked up this all-purpose sand. Sometimes you can find all-purpose sand called Mason sand. The brand doesn't matter. It's the kind of sand that matters. This is the one that I will be using. Alternatively, you could get plaster sand. You can tell the difference here. Plaster sand is finer in texture, but I'm not going to be using that, and I'll tell you why. Last option that I have here is silver sand, otherwise known as silica sand. This is probably the most fine of them all. This is the 30 grit. You can actually get this all the way up into 120 grit. I mean, it's darn near a powder at that point. This is the 30 grit. It's still easily the finest of them all. I'm not using that. Now, to illustrate my purposes for this leveling job, I just want to show you this, even though it's not necessarily part of this video. This is the leveling job that I'm going to be doing. My level is flush on the ground everywhere over here, except for right there. And that's about 1 inch, about 1 inch in depth, almost to my second knuckle. I could follow this line the whole way, all the way up to my fence, and you're going to find the depression is right there. This is exactly where we put our drain line in last spring. Additionally, I'd like to add a little bit of material right along the edge here to make it a little bit easier to run the mower and to edge in this area. This ground right here is actually a little bit higher than the curb, and then when we get over here, it's significantly lower. So that means I won't really be putting any material there, but I will be putting it along the curb edge all the way to almost the end. Now, when it comes to putting sand down on the lawn, you don't want the sand to be round. So on a microscopic level, if you really zoom in and look at it close, you want the edges to be jagged. And for the reason for that is if it's really round, then that means when it's dry, it can literally run off with wind, kicking it with your foot, or if there's a big heavy downpour. So play sand being the finest of them all, it's washed, it's cleaned, it's mostly free of, or at least aerosolized silica, but it's really polished, round. So when you put it on the ground, it's going to go away. Now, of course, when you get it wet and then it dries out, it's not going to crust. And we don't want it to crust on our lawns, but we want to have some rigidity there so that it stays in place. If you look closely at all of these bags, you're going to really notice, or at least hopefully you'll notice, they are all sourced from quartz. And because they're all sourced from quartz, they're not going to bond together like concrete without some sort of additive. This is unlike decomposed granite, which I don't have here, which is made from decomposed granite, crushed granite. It's a different rock. Now, when it comes to the health implications of silica, see this right here? Warning, contains silica sand. That warning has to do with the silica dust that can get into the air and that you can breathe it in. There's nothing wrong with holding it in your hand. The problem is when it's dry and becomes dusty and aerosolized. That's when it becomes a significant health problem. This is why when you look at these things, you see washed plaster sand. So they're trying to get rid of as much of the aerosolized quantity of that silica. So long as it's in little rocks that don't float through your air into your lungs, you're going to be fine. And that's going to go for all of these, including the play sand. Play sand is also going to have some silica in there, but it is the least dusty of them all, which is why it's also probably the most expensive of them all. When you look at play sand in its dry form, it's got small little particles in there and dust little particles in there, but none of the dust goes into the air. And when you look at it when it's wet, it holds together and it feels very soft. That's because all of these particles, for the most part, are fairly well rounded, meaning they don't have jagged edges, although you are going to find some that do. You absolutely could put play sand down on the lawn to do lawn leveling, but it's not going to hold its shape good enough. For the vast majority of people using it, you're probably not going to want to pay the extra price for a sand that's not going to hold its shape on the ground as well as you want it to. When you put this stuff down, you want everything to stay flat. You don't want it to move around every time it rains. All right, now of the sands that we have here, paver sand is the most obvious choice to not use for lawn leveling. The reason for that is because not only is it sand, look at this, sand looks pretty similar to the all-purpose sand, except for the color. There are additives placed into paver sand during the manufacturing process, I suppose. I don't know, I've never been in a factory making it, but they put stuff in this so that when it gets wet, so it's funny is it doesn't, I mean, it feels malleable, but as the wet dries and becomes dry, it starts caking together. This is when we talk about crust, that's what it's supposed to do. The additives in paver sand make it so that it crusts to the point where it becomes extremely hard, so that you could fill cracks in between pavers and everything would stay there. This is obviously what we don't want to use on the lawn, nor do we really want to even mix it in with our soil. It just doesn't make any sense to do that. So, considering its texture is very similar to all-purpose sand, otherwise known as masonry sand, this is actually what I'm going to be using. This is coarse. We have a variety of particle sizes. Some of the sizes are small. Some of the sizes are bigger. You've got a lot of texture. And when it is wet, it will hold together and it will dry and it will form a crust, but not a particularly hard crust. It's a crust that breaks apart somewhat easily. Because we have such a variety, it's going to fill a lot of space, but the larger particles, but the larger particles are going to allow water to filter through a little bit easier. And because everything has more of a jagged edge appearance to it, it's not going to wash away or blow away or erode as easily as play sand. Plaster sand I'm not going to use. Plaster sand is pretty much like this, except for everything is far more uniform. It's been more heavily processed and screened to give us more uniform size and shape. It's going to be a little bit more dusty, and it will move around a little bit more. And because everything fits together, I don't know why. I really don't know why, but this forms a harder crust. So if I were to get this wet and leave it to dry, it literally is a harder crust than this. I don't know. If you know why, let me know in the comments. I haven't figured that one out, but it just does. This is the kind of stuff that is used at construction for more polished concrete work as opposed to rough concrete work. I don't know if concrete's the right word, but I mean plaster. It's used in plastering. Anything that's going to be less rough, use this stuff because the sand itself is much softer. So it still feels gritty because the particles aren't exactly rounded like play sand, but it is significantly softer in texture than coarse sand, which I don't have here. So I just opted to not buy coarse sand. Coarse sand is clearly not going to be used. It is used to make concrete. It is it's almost like a tiny little gravel, very abrasive, very large particle sizes, almost like a whole bunch of tiny jagged rocks. The reason it's used in construction of concrete is because of strength and probably a handful of other things. I'm not an expert in concrete, so I'm going to leave it at that. That does bring us to the most obvious fifth option, silver sand or quartz sand, otherwise known as silica sand. So all of these sands, they're made with silica. We're talking silica sand is silicon dioxide. It's silica and oxygen. That's literally what it is. So to make silica sand, The sand needs to be at least 95% silicon dioxide. That means of all of these bags here, each one of these 4 are less than 95% silicon dioxide. It doesn't say it on the label, but we know it because they don't call it silver sand or silica sand. This is silica sand. And you notice silica sand is almost always a lighter color. I don't want to say it always is, because I'm not 100% expert on geology. I'm probably significantly less than 100% expert on geology. But as you look at the dry sand, the silica sand is significantly whiter than everything else. Look at this, side by side, even with the play sand. Silica is notably whiter. This also happens to be the finest of them all. And although this is not supposed to be smooth, it's such a fine grit that it feels smooth. And although you could use this out in the lawn, I would not, because the benefit of the all-purpose sand or the masonry sand is that it's not so pure. We actually don't want it to be very pure. This stuff is probably in the vicinity of 80% silicon dioxide. The remaining 20% is going to be a variety of other minerals. We're going to be getting some iron and some potassium, some carbonate. There's a whole bunch of other like trace elements and minerals that occupy the other 20% or so, give or take. I mean, don't quote me that it's literally 80% silicon dioxide, but that's a good rule of thumb to start off with. Another reason to not go with something like this is that cannot contain more than about 3% of silt or clay. This stuff has been washed to the point where it's almost pure sand, whereas some of the others over there are more likely to contain slightly higher amounts of silt and clay. So in a real lawn, we don't just have sand. We have sand, we have silt, we have clay, and we have organic matter. Now, I'm going to get the organic matter from my soil, but I can't just run off to the store and buy bags of silt or clay. So because this is going to have the least amount in it, I'm going to go back to the construction sand, the masonry sand, yet again. Although this is cleaned, it's washed, it is coarse, it's got a variety of elements in there, and it's more likely to have a higher concentration of silt, which is going to be great to mix together with my organic matter and then throw it into the lawn. As always, when you're doing any leveling project, you want everything to be super dry when you put it down. It's actually pretty hard to buy sand and soil that's completely dry. So if you find a source that has extremely dry sand, then I don't know, that place is like worth its weight in gold. Pay a premium for that stuff. Right in here, these bags of all-purpose sand, this stuff is wet right out of the bag. This is what it looks like right out of the bag. This stuff right here, I literally put it in the microwave for 5 minutes just to make it dry so that we could see the difference. So I'm going to take all 4 bags of this sand, stick it out on a tarp in the sun, and let the sun dry it out as much as I possibly can before I mix it together with my organic matter and then eventually stick it on the lawn. If you want to learn more about actually leveling your lawn, I got a video right up here that goes into a lot more of the detail. If you got any questions about this sand, drop them in the comments box below.